The harbor is unusually quiet. It is the early 15th century, somewhere on the Indian Ocean. Before dawn, a merchant ship slips into port under heavy sails, its hull scarred by storms that have carried it thousands of miles from distant shores. Dock workers gather silently along the pier, not to unload gold, silver, or precious gems, but bundles of dried tree bark. Each bundle is wrapped in coarse cloth and sealed with wax. Armed guards stand nearby, not because the cargo is fragile, because it is priceless. One merchant carefully unties a package. Inside are dozens of thin, tightly curled sticks, no longer than a man's hand. They look almost worthless, dry, brown, light enough to snap between two fingers. Yet wealthy buyers will soon pay extraordinary sums for them. Some will lock them inside carved wooden chests. Others will present them as gifts fit for kings. Apothecaries will grind them into medicines believed to cure illness. Noble families will sprinkle them over lavish banquets as a public display of unimaginable wealth. Few of them know where the spice truly comes from. Fewer still have ever seen the tree that produced it. That ignorance is no accident. For centuries, the world's most powerful merchants protected cinnamon with one of history's greatest trade secrets. They invented fantastic stories. Some claimed giant birds gathered cinnamon sticks to build nests atop impossible cliffs. Others insisted it grew in valleys guarded by deadly serpents. The message was always the same. Do not ask where cinnamon comes from. Simply pay the price. Today, cinnamon sits quietly on supermarket shelves around the world. We stir it into coffee, dust it over oatmeal, bake it into cookies, cakes, and warm apple pies without giving it a second thought. It is one of the most familiar spices on earth. But there was a time when a handful of cinnamon could be worth more than gold by weight. When kingdoms fought to control its trade, fortunes were built on its mystery, and oceans were crossed in search of the forests that produced it. The history of exploration is usually told through famous navigators and powerful empires. Hidden behind many of those voyages was the sweet scent of a simple piece of bark. When people think about the treasures that shaped history, they usually imagine familiar symbols of wealth: gold bars, silver coins, precious gemstones, silk from China, jewels worn by kings and queens. Tree bark almost never makes the list. And yet, for centuries, cinnamon was one of the most valuable commodities on earth. Today, it costs only a few dollars. You can find it in nearly every grocery store, tucked between black pepper and paprika. It flavors breakfast cereal, coffee, pastries, and holiday desserts. Children sprinkle it over toast without realizing they are holding something that once traveled farther and cost more than many precious metals. That is the great paradox of cinnamon. The more ordinary it became, the easier it was to forget how extraordinary it once was. For much of the ancient and medieval world, cinnamon was not simply a spice. It was a luxury, a medicine, a perfume, a diplomatic gift, a religious offering, a symbol of status so exclusive that owning it announced your place among society's elite. Ancient Egyptian embalmers used aromatic spices, including cinnamon and related cassia, in some mummification practices. Greek physicians praised it in medical writings. Roman emperors burned enormous quantities of cinnamon during lavish ceremonies, sometimes as displays of both grief and unimaginable wealth. Medieval apothecaries prescribed it for everything from digestive troubles to winter illnesses, while noble households measured their prosperity by the exotic spices stored in locked cabinets. But perhaps cinnamon's greatest power had nothing to do with its flavor. It came from mystery. For thousands of years, Almost nobody in Europe, North Africa, or the Middle East knew where cinnamon actually grew. Merchants made sure of that. Arab traders, who dominated much of the spice trade for centuries, carefully guarded its true origin. Rather than revealing the forests where cinnamon was harvested, they told stories of dangerous expeditions, giant birds, venomous snakes, and hidden valleys that only the bravest hunters could reach. The stories were absurd. They were also incredibly effective. If buyers believed cinnamon came from the edge of the known world, they would never question why it cost a fortune. Knowledge became more valuable than the spice itself. Entire fortunes depended on keeping one simple secret. Where did cinnamon really come from? The search for that answer would reshape global trade, drive explorers across uncharted oceans, and ignite fierce competition between some of history's greatest maritime empires. Because the kingdoms that controlled cinnamon did not simply sell a spice, they controlled one of the world's most profitable illusions. Long before cinnamon filled bakeries with the scent of fresh pastries, it grew quietly in the tropical forests of an island most of the ancient world had never seen. That island was Sri Lanka, known to ancient civilizations by different names over thousands of years. Warm monsoon rains, rich soil, and humid coastal forests created the perfect environment for the delicate inner bark of the Cinnamomum verum tree, what we now call true cinnamon. To the people who harvested it, cinnamon was simply another gift of the forest. To the rest of the world, it became a mystery worth a fortune. Unlike wheat or olives, cinnamon could not be grown almost anywhere. It depended on a unique climate, careful cultivation, and skilled harvesting. Workers did not simply cut down the trees. Instead, they carefully peeled away the thin inner bark from young shoots, then allowed the strips to dry naturally. As they dried, something remarkable happened. The bark curled into the elegant quills we still recognize today. Nature had created one of the world's most valuable products almost entirely by itself. By the 2nd millennium BC, cinnamon and its close relative cassia had already begun traveling astonishing distances. Egyptian records and archaeological evidence suggest that aromatic spices from the east reached the Nile through long-distance trade networks, where they became prized ingredients in perfumes, religious rituals, and elite burials. To ancient Egyptians, fragrance was never merely pleasant, it was sacred. Temples filled with the smoke of burning incense believed to carry prayers toward the gods. During the elaborate process of mummification, aromatic substances, including cinnamon and cassia, among other imported spices and resins, helped preserve bodies destined for the afterlife. These rare materials symbolized purity, immortality, and divine favor. Thousands of miles away, another civilization was discovering cinnamon's value for entirely different reasons. In ancient China, early medical traditions described aromatic barks believed to include varieties of cinnamon as warming substances that restored balance within the body. Physicians prescribed them for circulation, digestion, and seasonal illnesses, weaving the spice into one of the world's oldest continuously practiced medical systems. Meanwhile, across Mesopotamia and the Eastern Mediterranean, merchants quietly transformed cinnamon into something even more powerful than medicine: a luxury. The farther cinnamon traveled from its forests, the more valuable it became. Every caravan crossing Arabia, every ship sailing the Indian Ocean, every merchant changing hands along the route added another layer of cost. By the time a handful of cinnamon reached cities like Babylon, Tyre, Alexandria, or later Rome, its price reflected thousands of miles of transport and countless middlemen. But distance alone did not explain its astonishing value. Information did. Very few buyers knew where cinnamon originated. Even fewer understood how it was harvested. That ignorance became the foundation of one of history's most profitable monopolies. Because the merchants who controlled the spice trade realized something extraordinary. If no one knew where cinnamon grew, no one could compete with the people who sold it. By the time cinnamon reached the markets of medieval Europe, it had already crossed oceans, survived monsoon storms, changed hands dozens of times, and accumulated a price that only the wealthy could afford. Every mile made it more valuable. Every merchant added another profit. Every mystery surrounding its origin made buyers even more willing to pay. For Europe's nobles, cinnamon was never simply something to eat. It was something to display. At royal banquets, cooks added cinnamon to roasted meats, wines, fruit dishes, and elaborate desserts, not because every recipe required it, but because every guest would recognize its cost. A heavily spiced feast announced that the host possessed access to the rarest goods on earth. The aroma itself became a declaration of power. A room filled with the scent of cinnamon told visitors exactly how wealthy its owner was. The spice found its way into castles, monasteries, and royal courts across Europe. Physicians mixed it into expensive remedies. Perfumers blended it with precious oils. Clergy burned aromatic spices during important religious ceremonies, while merchants stored their most valuable supplies behind locked doors. But the greatest fortunes were not made by those who used cinnamon. They were made by those who controlled it. For centuries, Arab merchants dominated the overland and maritime trade routes connecting the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean. They purchased spices from traders farther east, transported them through carefully guarded networks, and sold them at enormous profits to European buyers. Their greatest weapon was not their ships, it was information. European merchants desperately wanted to know where cinnamon originated. The answer remained hidden. Instead of revealing the truth, traders repeated marvelous legends that had circulated for generations. According to one famous story, giant birds gathered cinnamon sticks to build nests on towering cliffs. Hunters supposedly left large pieces of meat at the base of the rocks. The birds carried the meat to their nests, causing the branches to collapse under the weight. Only then could people collect the precious cinnamon. Another tale described valleys filled with venomous serpents that guarded the spice from anyone foolish enough to approach. These stories were not meant to entertain. They were meant to discourage curiosity. If buyers believed cinnamon could only be obtained through impossible danger, they would never imagine ordinary harvesters peeling bark from trees in tropical forests. The myths protected the monopoly, and monopolies created fortunes. By the late Middle Ages, another group entered the story: the Merchant Republic of Venice. Positioned between Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean, Venice became the continent's greatest commercial gateway. Venetian merchants purchased spices arriving through ports like Alexandria and distributed them across Europe at substantial markups. Cinnamon became one of the city's most profitable imports, enriching merchant families whose influence rivaled that of kings. Yet every transaction depended on countless middlemen. Venice bought from Arab traders. Arab traders bought through Indian Ocean networks. Those networks relied on merchants from South Asia and beyond. Each step increased the price. European rulers watched enormous sums of wealth flow eastward year after year. They began asking a dangerous question. Why should we keep buying cinnamon when we could find it ourselves? That single question would transform world history. It inspired sailors to venture beyond familiar coastlines, funded ambitious expeditions into unknown seas, and fueled the rise of powerful maritime kingdoms determined to break the ancient spice trade. Portugal searched for a sea route around Africa. Spain gambled on sailing west across the Atlantic. Neither voyage was motivated by curiosity alone, Both were driven, in part, by the promise of reaching the spice trade without paying its existing gatekeepers. Cinnamon had become far more than an ingredient. It had become a prize worth risking fleets, fortunes, and lives. The race to control it would redraw the map of the world. And on one lush island in the Indian Ocean, where cinnamon trees continued to grow as they always had, the arrival of European empires was about to change everything. For centuries, Europe dreamed of finding the source of cinnamon. Now, that dream had become an obsession. By the late 15th century, the Ottoman Empire controlled many of the traditional trade routes connecting Europe to Asia. Every shipment of spices passed through layers of merchants, taxes, and political rivalries before reaching European markets. Cinnamon became even more expensive. European kingdoms realized that whoever could reach the spice at its source would no longer have to depend on middlemen. The rewards were almost unimaginable. So they began looking for another way. In 1498, after years of dangerous voyages around the coast of Africa, the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama reached India by sea. It was one of the greatest navigational achievements in history, opening a direct maritime route between Europe and the Indian Ocean. The voyage was celebrated as an age of discovery, but behind the glory was a far simpler goal: spices, pepper, cloves, nutmeg, and above all, cinnamon. The Portuguese quickly realized that the finest cinnamon did not come from India itself. Its true home lay farther south, on the island of Ceylon, known today as Sri Lanka. There, generations of skilled harvesters had perfected the delicate process of peeling the inner bark from young cinnamon shoots, producing the fragrant quills that European elites prized above almost every other spice. In 1505, Portuguese ships reached the island. At first, they came as traders. Before long, they became conquerors. Fortresses rose along the coastline. Harbors were fortified. Local rulers were pressured into agreements that guaranteed steady supplies of cinnamon to the Portuguese crown. What had once been a regional trade became an imperial monopoly. For more than a century, Portuguese fleets carried ship after ship loaded with cinnamon back to Europe, generating immense wealth and strengthening Portugal's position as one of the world's leading maritime powers. Yet monopolies rarely last forever. In the 17th century, another rising naval power challenged Portuguese dominance. The Dutch East India Company, or VOC, unlike earlier merchant guilds, the VOC was something entirely new. It possessed its own ships, its own soldiers, its own governors. It could negotiate treaties, wage war, and establish colonies almost like an independent nation. To the Dutch, cinnamon was not merely a luxury. It was a business worth fighting for. After years of conflict, the Dutch seized control of much of Ceylon's cinnamon-producing regions in the mid-1600s. Determined to keep prices high, they imposed strict control over production and export. Historical accounts describe how cinnamon trees growing outside their controlled areas were sometimes destroyed or tightly regulated to protect the monopoly and prevent competitors from increasing supply. The objective was simple: scarcity created profit. The less cinnamon available, the more Europe would pay. For the people of Sri Lanka, however, the story looked very different. Communities that had harvested cinnamon for generations now found themselves working under colonial systems designed to enrich distant empires. The forests that had long sustained local livelihoods became strategic assets in a global struggle for wealth. A spice that had once been part of regional life was transformed into an instrument of imperial power. Eventually, the British would replace the Dutch, inheriting control of Ceylon in the late 18th century and continuing to export its famous cinnamon across the expanding British Empire. Over 3 centuries, the flags changed, the rulers changed, the ships changed, But the prize remained exactly the same: a strip of fragrant tree bark. The search for cinnamon had done far more than enrich merchants. It had accelerated the age of exploration. It had fueled colonial expansion across the Indian Ocean. It had helped build some of the world's first global trading empires. All because humanity believed one small spice was worth crossing oceans to possess. Ironically, that extraordinary value would not last forever. The very forces that made cinnamon priceless would eventually make it ordinary. For thousands of years, cinnamon had belonged to kings. It perfumed royal palaces. It filled the medicine cabinets of the wealthy. It traveled under armed guard across oceans. Its price reflected not only its rarity, but the extraordinary effort required to control it. Then, something unexpected happened. The secret disappeared. As European powers expanded their reach across Asia, they no longer depended on rumors, legends, or hidden trade routes. They knew exactly where cinnamon grew. They understood how it was harvested. More importantly, they learned how to cultivate it on a larger scale. Knowledge accomplished what armies never could. It broke the monopoly. By the 18th and 19th centuries, improvements in navigation, larger merchant fleets, and increasingly organized global trade brought cinnamon to Europe in far greater quantities than ever before. What had once arrived in tiny shipments for royal households now reached busy ports by the ton. As supply increased, prices slowly fell. For the first time, cinnamon began appearing on the tables of merchants, craftsmen, and eventually, ordinary families. The spice that had once symbolized privilege was becoming part of everyday life. The Industrial Revolution accelerated the transformation. Steamships shortened voyages that had once taken months. Railroads carried imported goods deep into growing cities. Modern mills processed spices more efficiently, while advances in packaging allowed cinnamon to be sold in stores, rather than exclusively through specialized merchants. The world was becoming smaller, and cinnamon was traveling farther than ever before. At the same time, another change quietly reshaped the market. Most people buying cinnamon today are actually purchasing cassia, a closely related spice with a stronger, spicier flavor and a lower production cost. Native to parts of China and Southeast Asia, cassia proved easier and less expensive to cultivate on a large scale than the delicate Ceylon cinnamon of Sri Lanka. For centuries, many consumers scarcely noticed the difference. The result was a dramatic increase in availability. What had once been among the world's rarest luxuries became one of its most accessible seasonings. Today, cinnamon flavors everything from breakfast cereal and coffee to cinnamon rolls, pumpkin pie, oatmeal, chocolates, and holiday drinks. Every autumn, its warm aroma fills cafes and kitchens across North America, becoming almost synonymous with comfort itself. Few people pause to wonder how such a familiar spice once inspired voyages across unknown oceans, or how empires fought to possess the forests where it grew. Cinnamon lost the exclusivity that had made it priceless, but in doing so, it gained something far greater. It escaped the palaces of kings. It entered millions of homes. The spice that once belonged to only a privileged few had finally become part of the daily lives of people around the world. And despite that extraordinary transformation, its journey through history was far from over. Empires have risen. Empires have fallen. Trade routes that once connected continents have disappeared beneath deserts or been replaced by modern shipping lanes. The kingdoms that fought over cinnamon are gone. The merchant monopolies that guarded its secret have vanished. Yet cinnamon remains, not because it won wars, not because it conquered nations, but because it earned a permanent place in everyday life. Few ingredients have crossed so many cultures so effortlessly. In Mexico, it flavors rich chocolate and café de olla. Across the Middle East, it perfumes rice dishes, stews, and fragrant teas. In India, it forms part of garam masala, one of the world's most influential spice blends. Throughout Europe and North America, it has become inseparable from fresh bread, apple pie, cookies, cinnamon rolls, and the comforting aromas of autumn and winter. The recipes are different. The traditions are different. But the reason people keep reaching for cinnamon has barely changed in thousands of years. It makes ordinary food unforgettable. Modern science has also renewed interest in the spice. Researchers continue to study compounds found in cinnamon for their potential health effects, including antioxidant properties and possible roles in blood sugar regulation. While some findings are promising, scientists also emphasize that cinnamon is not a miracle cure and should never replace balanced nutrition or medical treatment. Its greatest strength has never been magic. It has always been versatility. A little cinnamon can transform a simple bowl of oatmeal, a cup of coffee, a family recipe passed down through generations. That may be the real reason cinnamon survived while countless other luxury goods faded into history. It adapted. As prices fell, it did not lose its purpose. It found a new one. Today, billions of people recognize its warm, unmistakable aroma without ever considering the extraordinary journey behind it. The scent drifting from a bakery, or rising from a mug on a cold morning, is the same fragrance that once filled the courts of pharaohs, the banquets of emperors, the cabins of explorers, and the cargo holds of ships crossing unknown seas. Some treasures disappear when their value fades. Cinnamon became something even rarer, a treasure that the whole world could finally share. Imagine that merchant ship one last time. Its sails are worn from months at sea. Its cargo is carefully guarded, not because it carries gold, not because it carries jewels, but because its wooden crates are filled with bundles of cinnamon, a spice that kings desired. A spice that inspired myths. A spice that helped launch voyages across unknown oceans. Centuries later, the voyage is over. The great monopolies have disappeared. The empires that fought over cinnamon exist only in history books. But the spice remains. Today, a small jar of cinnamon sits quietly on your kitchen shelf. You twist off the lid without a second thought. A light dusting falls into your coffee, across warm oatmeal, onto fresh-baked cookies or apple pie. It feels ordinary, almost too ordinary to notice. Yet every pinch carries the legacy of thousands of years. It carries the hands of Sri Lankan harvesters who carefully peeled the bark from young trees, the merchants who crossed the Indian Ocean guided only by the stars, the physicians who treasured its fragrance, the explorers who risked their lives searching for its source, and the countless families who transformed it from a royal luxury into a beloved tradition shared around the world. Cinnamon never built a palace. It never ruled a kingdom. It never commanded an army. Yet it quietly shaped economies, inspired exploration, connected continents, and changed the course of global trade. Perhaps that is its greatest legacy. Not that it was once worth more than gold, but that it reminds us how something seemingly small can influence the fate of civilizations. The next time you smell cinnamon rising from a warm cup of coffee or a freshly baked dessert, remember this. You are experiencing an aroma that traveled across oceans, survived the rise and fall of empires, and connected people from distant cultures long before the modern world existed. Sometimes, the greatest forces in history are not the loudest. Sometimes, they are as quiet as the scent of a single piece of bark.